Chapter 9 Expulsion from Eden. Few episodes in American religious history parallel the barbarism of anti-Mormon persecutions. That the town in which these began should bear the name of Independence only accentuates the tragic irony of the case. Intermittently for 13 years, burnings and pillaging hounded the Mormons wherever they tried to settle in the Mississippi Valley, until it seemed there was something inevitable in the terrorism that bloodied their trail. The tenuous, shifting area known as the frontier attracted men who, though brave and adventurous, were often also illiterate, thriftless, and antisocial. Preferring hunting to farming, they packed their wagons and moved on west as soon as neighbors came within gunshot distance. Western Missouri, according to a traveling preacher of the time, had a semi-barbarian population constantly pressing on the heels of the retreating savages. In ordinary times this class would have sold out to the Mormons and moved on west, but now a barrier hemmed them in. Andrew Jackson in 1830 had fixed the Indian frontier by law, thereby temporarily forbidding them the space for roaming to which they were accustomed, and the vast plains to the west, barren of timber and short of water, did not invite the careless encroachment on Indian territory that had been so common in the central Mississippi Valley. The Missourians were irritated by reports of Mormon sermons like those of Oliver Cowdery, who told the Delawares that they should be restored to all their rights and privileges, should cease to fight and kill one another, should become one people, cultivate the earth in peace, in common with the pale-faces. To any frontiersman this was political imbecility. Moreover, the Mormons were not luck hunters, eager to move on if new territory opened up or a crop was blistered by frost. They had come to stay till the millennium, buying and building with a kind of desperate haste lest the day of the Lord's coming find their lamps untrimmed. Their very industry counted against them. Professional gamblers, real estate speculators, and tradesmen who lived by their wits and swallowed the political emoluments of the county watched with a dour resentment Mormon cabins springing up and Mormon crops showing green among the tree stumps. Even the more literate of the lot, the editors, lawyers, and clergymen, were agitated over the political implications of the Mormon emigration. "The day is not far distant," they complained, "when the sheriff, the justices, and the county judges will be Mormons, or persons wishing to court their favor from motives of interest or ambition. What would be the fate of our lives and property in the hands of jurors and witnesses, who do not blush to declare, and would not upon occasion hesitate to swear, that they have wrought miracles, and have been the subjects of miraculous supernatural cures, have conversed with God and his angels, and possess and exercise the gifts of divination and of unknown tongues, and fired with the prospect of obtaining inheritances without money and without price, may better be imagined than described." The Mormon settlers were no more tactful than most religious zealots, and their very enthusiasm was an irritation. "We are daily told," the settlers said, "and not by the ignorant alone, but by all classes of them, that we, the Gentiles, of this county, are to be cut off, and our lands appropriated by them for inheritances. Whether this is to be accomplished by the hand of the destroying angel, the judgments of God, or the arm of power, they are not fully agreed among themselves." Worst crime of all, the Mormons were northerners who owned no slaves. Previous to their arrival, the bulk of the immigrants had come from Kentucky and Tennessee, many with a retinue of Negroes. The population of Missouri in 1830 was over 1/5 slave. Early in 1832, the old settlers accused the Mormons of endeavoring to sow dissensions and raise seditions among their slaves, and the church elders promised to curb the offenders. In the following year, a handful of free Negroes who had been converted to the church tried to emigrate to Independence. Phelps discovered that a Missouri law forbade their entry without a certificate of citizenship from another state, and published in a reprint of the statute in the Evening and Morning Star, in order, he said, "to prevent any misunderstanding among the churches abroad respecting free people of color who may think of coming to the western boundaries of Missouri, as well as the church, as members of the church." He added in what he believed was a cautious vein, since he knew he was handling dynamite. "So long as we have no special rule in the church as to people of color, let prudence guide, and while they, as well as we, are in the hands of a merciful God, we say, shun every appearance of evil." Later in the same issue he wrote, "As to slaves, we have nothing to say. In connection with the wonderful events of this age, much is doing towards abolishing slavery and colonizing the blacks in Africa." Phelps was completely unprepared for the explosion that followed. The old settlers, who believed it to be a direct invitation to free Negroes to immigrate to Missouri, with explicit instructions for evading the law designed to exclude them, immediately called a mass meeting. Here they drew up a manifesto demanding the expulsion of the Mormons. We believed them deluded fanatics, they wrote, were weak and designing knaves, and that they and their pretensions would soon pass away, but in this we were deceived. Denouncing Phelps's articles, they insisted that the coming of free Negroes would corrupt their blacks and instigate them to bloodshed. We therefore agree, the manifesto concluded, that after timely warning and receiving inadequate compensation for what little property they cannot take with them, if they refuse to leave us in peace, as they found us, we agree to use such means as may be sufficient to remove them, and to that end we each pledge to each other our bodily powers, our lives, fortunes, and sacred honors. Among the hundreds of signatures to this declaration were the names of all the county officers elected to administer justice, the judge of the court, the county clerk, the constable, the deputy, and the jailer. Phelps somersaulted backwards to undo the mischief. Knowing that another mass meeting was scheduled for July 20, he rushed the publication of a Star Extra, which said in part, "Having learned with extreme regret that an article entitled Free People of Color in the last number of the Star has been misunderstood, we feel in duty bound to state in this extra that our intention was not only to stop free people of color from emigrating to this state, but to prevent them from being admitted as members of the church." Ignoring this recantation, 500 settlers met in Independence and drew up 5 demands. First, that no Mormons settle in Jackson County in the future. Second, that those already settled promise to sell their lands and leave. Third, that the Mormon press, storehouse, and shops close immediately. And fourth, that the leaders stop all immigration from Ohio. The 5th demand was a not too cryptic direction that those who fail to comply with these requisitions be referred to those of their brethren who have the gifts of divination and of unknown tongues to inform them of the lot that awaits them. The mass meeting shortly turned into a mob. When the demands were read aloud, the men gave a great shout and headed for the Mormon community west of the town. Partridge was given exactly 15 minutes to capitulate. When he pleaded for more time, the men marched to the Star office, where they wrecked the press, smashed the furniture, and then razed the 2-story brick building. All copies they could find of the Book of Commandments, the compilation of Joseph's Revelations, were carried off or destroyed. Not content with destruction of property, the mob thirsted for the sport of mauling men, and Edward Partridge and Charles Allen fell victim to that ever-popular diversion, the Tar and Feather Party. When night fell, the women and children who fled to the woods and cornfields crept back into Independence and gathered timidly to stare at the ruin that had been the press office. Many crowded into the home of Edward Partridge, whose friends were scraping at the tar on his body to keep the acid that had been mixed with it from eating into his flesh. Despite his pain, the bishop maintained a stoic dignity, saying quietly that he bore the mob no malice and was proud to have been persecuted for the truth's sake. His frightened people were raised to a kind of solemn ecstasy by the joy he took in his suffering, feeling themselves kin to the ancient disciples of Jesus who had bled and died for the gospel. 3 days later, the mob reassembled and charged into the Mormon settlement, brandishing dirks and rifles, threatening the church leaders with 100 lashes, the equivalent of a death sentence, and swearing that unless the whole colony left Jackson County, their slaves would fire the Mormon crops in cabins. Under this pressure, the 9 leading Mormon men promised that they would leave the county with half the colony by January 1, the remainder to follow before spring. Joseph was appalled when Oliver Cowdery brought him this news. Until now, opposition had been directed chiefly against his own person, and he had long since learned to meet ridicule and threats with indifference. Always affable and rapidly growing in political wisdom, he had scorned reprisals. Now he cautioned his people in Independence to do likewise. An immediate revelation ordered them to renounce war and proclaim peace, and bear all indignities with patience. Joseph's only direct action was to delegate 2 men to petition the governor of Missouri for justice. Unofficially, he suggested that Zion had brought down the calamity upon herself. "I am not at all astonished," he wrote on September 4 to Vienna Jacques, "at what has happened to you, neither to what has happened to Zion, and I could tell you the whys and wherefores of all these calamities, but, alas, it is vain to warn and give precepts, for all men are naturally disposed to walk in their own paths as they are pointed out by their own fingers, and are not willing to consider and walk in the path which is pointed out by another, although he should be an unerring director, and the Lord his God sent him." Few of the Missouri Mormons had a better right to an explanation for Zion's misfortunes than Vienna Jacques, a bachelor woman with a modest capital of $1,400. She had been ordered to Zion by a personal revelation from Joseph, which had commanded her to take only enough money for expenses and to consecrate the remainder to the Lord. In return for her faithfulness, she had been promised an inheritance and independence. To comfort her now, Joseph concluded his letter with a prayer and a promise. O Lord, let Zion be comforted. Let her waste places be built up and established an hundredfold. Let thy handmaid live till her soul shall be satisfied in beholding the glory of Zion. For notwithstanding her present affliction, she shall yet arise and put on her beautiful garments, and be the joy and glory of the whole earth. Therefore let your heart be comforted. I will assure you that the Lord has respect unto the offering you made. Early in October 1833, Joseph and Sidney Rigdon left Kirtland on a preaching tour through Canada and the East. Joseph could do nothing for Zion, and he knew it. To go there himself would only further inflame the old settlers, and to remain in Kirtland meant facing the remonstrances of his people, who could not understand his inaction. He suggested that those in Missouri who were in the greatest danger leave Jackson County, but advised the remainder to wait until the animosity had died down before taking any action. Cowdery he sent off into New York to buy a new printing press, promising that if he set it up in Kirtland, he should be the editor of the Star. Upon his return from Canada, Joseph was more noncommittal about Zion than before. We are informed, however, he wrote to Moses Nickerson on November 19, that those persons, the mob, are very violent and threaten immediate extermination upon all those who profess our doctrine. How far they will be suffered to execute their threats, we know not, but we trust in the Lord and leave the event with him to govern in his own wise providence. Following their prophet's counsel, the Missouri converts turned the other cheek. Their only action in self-defense was a vigorous petition to the governor requesting sufficient troops to maintain order while they brought suit for property damages. Replying late in October, Governor Dunklin expressed warm sympathy but postponed action by advising the Mormons to appeal first of all to the local judges. The church leaders and independents then sought out 4 lawyers, Wood, Reese, Doniphan, and Atchison, who agreed to take their case. The following night, October 31, 1833, 50 men attacked an outlying Mormon colony west of the Big Blue River, unroofed and partly demolished 10 cabins, whipped and stoned the men, and drove the women and children shrieking into the woods. When this was repeated on subsequent nights, the Mormons began to organize for defense. Learning late one afternoon that the storehouse was being sacked, one hastily armed group rushed to the spot. Only a single culprit, who had stayed to hurl a final brickbat through the door, was caught. When he was taken before a justice of the peace, the justice not only refused to swear out a warrant for his arrest, but actually arrested and jailed the captors on the prisoner's cry of false arrest. John Corll, in his history, commented wryly on this incident. Although we could not obtain a warrant against him for breaking open the store, yet he had gotten one for us by catching him at it. Organizing and arming as best as they could, the Mormons tried patrolling their own settlements. One band, led by David Whitmer, clashed with some marauders on November 4. In the exchange of fire, 2 non-Mormons and 1 Mormon were killed. Magnified reports of this affray spread terror through the county. The infuriated old settlers threatened to murder the Mormons they had already jailed, and at the same time screamed for the militia lest the Mormons, in revenge for their own dead, massacre the citizens of Independence. It is possible, wrote Isaac McCoy in an inflammatory letter to the Missouri Intelligencer, that they designed to kill or drive out all the inhabitants or destroy the village. The lieutenant governor of the state, Lilburn Boggs, who was living in Independence at the time, called out the militia to restore order, but he placed at its head Colonel Thomas Pitcher, who had been one of the signers of the Manifesto ordering the Mormons to leave the county. Boggs himself was one of the biggest landowners in western Missouri, his holdings stretching along the river from Livingston to Independence. No one more than he feared the influx of a sizable voting bloc of non-slaveholders. Hearing that their imprisoned brethren were about to be shot, the Mormons gathered in force just west of Independence. Here they were approached by Colonel Pitcher, who demanded the surrender of their arms and insisted that several men give themselves up to be tried for the murder and the 2 recently slain Missourians. Ostensibly friendly, Boggs personally urged the Mormons to obey, promising blandly that he would order Pitcher to disarm the mob as well. Despite their misgivings, the church leaders capitulated. The news that the Mormons were disarmed overspread the county in a single afternoon. When Boggs sardonically suggested that the old settlers also be disarmed, Pitcher grinned in his beard. That night, the mob systematically sacked every Mormon community, beat and whipped the men, and drove the women and children out like cattle. Before morning, 1,200 people had been herded forth in the teeth of a November gale. A few fled to Clay County, where they were received with sympathy. The majority huddled for days among the cottonwoods lining the Missouri River, hungry, weaponless, and leaderless, praying passionately for a miracle. The brutality of the Jackson County mob won for the Mormons their first champions outside the church. The Missouri press almost universally deplored the outrage, and newspapers throughout the nation reprinted the details with indignant editorial comment. The lawyers retained by the Mormons now threw caution aside and fought honestly for their clients' rights. Led by the courageous Doniphan, they roused Governor Dunklin to promise a military escort to return the Mormons to their homes. Dunklin gave them for the first time permission to organize into militia groups and to apply for public arms. He frankly said, however, that he had no constitutional power to maintain a constant guard once they had been reinstated, and without such protection the Mormons were afraid to return lest the whole bloody affair be repeated. They knew it was hazardous even to send witnesses to a court of inquiry, and begged that it be postponed until trustworthy militiamen could be sent into the county. Although some of the exiles now moved on into surrounding counties, the bulk of the Mormons remained bivouacked on the Missouri bottoms, waiting hopefully for word from their prophet. On the night of November 13, a cry of astonishment resounded through the camp. "In God's name, look to the heavens! The stars are falling out of the sky!" The shivering people crawled out of their bark shelters and peered upward through the gaunt trees. Hundreds of brilliant meteors were shooting across the firmament, leaving in their wake long trains of light. It was one of the greatest meteoric showers in the century, and all over the states people watched it, awed and frightened. But nowhere else, as among these outcasted men, greeted it with such rapture. "God be praised! It is a sign of the end of the world!" It took exactly 1 month for news of the banishment to reach the prophet. He received letters from Phelps and Hyde that were fairly accurate, but on the same day a courier brought him a fantastic story of a battle in which the Mormons had killed more than 20 Missourians. However ambitious he may have been for his people, Joseph had never counted on bloodshed to help his cause. He began dimly to realize the explosive possibilities of the theocracy he was building. From the first appearance of trouble he had forbidden reprisals, but now in some inexorable fashion there had come shooting, bleeding, and dying for his sake. Had Joseph's certainty of the divinity of the mission been more substantial, he would no doubt have cursed the Missouri settlers into hell for obstructing the work of the Lord. This, in fact, he finally did, but not until a decade later when he was writing the history of his church from a more secure position in Nauvoo, Illinois. Now he seems to have been racked with a sense of impotence and irresolution, for he replied to his wretched people in a half-suspicious vein that tripled their despair. "Dear brethren, we have just received a letter from Brother Phelps dated 6th and 7th November at Liberty, which gives us the painful intelligence of the rage of the enemy, and your present unsettled situation. But I must inform you that there is a great dubiety resting upon our minds with regard to the true state of affairs in Zion, for there seems to be some difference in the statements of Elder Phelps' letter and that of Elder Hyde's communication. It appears, brethren, that the above statements were made mostly from reports, and there is no certainty of their being correct. Therefore, it is difficult for us to advise, and we can only say that the destinies of all people are in the hands of a just God, and he will do no injustice to anyone. And this one thing is sure, that they who live godly in Christ Jesus shall suffer persecution. It is your privilege to use every lawful means in your power to seek redress for your grievances from your enemies, and prosecute them to the extent of the law, but it will be impossible for us to render you any temporal assistance, as our means are already exhausted, and we are deeply in debt, and know of no means whereby we shall be able to extricate ourselves." Kirtland, December 5th, 1833. 11 days later, on December 16th, a new revelation officially explained the curse that had descended over Zion. "I, the Lord, have suffered the affliction to come upon them, wherewith they have been afflicted, in a consequence of their transgressions. Behold, I say unto you, there were jarrings, and contentions, and envyings, and strifes, and lustful and covetous desires among them. Therefore by these things they polluted their inheritances." Phelps had been aware of this attitude in the prophet even before he saw the revelation, for he had written on December 15 a despairing letter that reflected the bewilderment of every devout man who has seen the innocent suffer along with the godless. I know that it was right that we should be driven out of the land of Zion, that the rebellions might be sent away. But, brethren, if the Lord will, I should like to know what the honest in heart shall do. Our clothes are worn out. We want the necessities of life, and we shall lease. And shall we lease, buy, or otherwise obtain land where we are, to till that we may raise enough to eat? Such is the common language of the honest, for they want to do the will of God. Most of the Mormons by now had settled in Clay County, where the citizens had agreed to give them temporary shelter. Pending a settlement, Joseph ordered the whole colony to remain as near Jackson County as possible, and emphatically forbade them to sell their property. He took this stand first of all because he did not yet realize the gravity and inevitability of the conflict between his own land-hungry, communistic millenarians and the frontier flotsam. Secondly, he had a stubborn faith in the law and a conviction that, if not in the local courts, then in Jefferson City or in Washington, his people would be accorded justice. Phelps wrote to him, "Our people fare very well, and when they are discreet, little or no persecution is felt." Such observations had helped to confirm his faith that a lasting peace might yet be established. He had his Missouri leaders prepare a petition to Andrew Jackson, and took pains to write an eloquent plea of his own. When it was finished, he mailed with it a copy of his latest revelation, in which the Lord had commanded the children of Zion to importune first at the feet of the judges, then at the feet of the governor, and finally at the feet of the president. And if the president heed them not, it said, then will the Lord arise and come forth out of his hiding place, and in his fury vex the nation. Even had this threat reached Jackson's desk, it probably would have gone unnoticed among the 3,000 words of the revelation. But Secretary snared the document and politely informed the prophet that his proper recourse was applied to the authorities of Missouri. Yet the gesture was not wasted on the Mormon people, who were comforted by the thought of Old Hickory quaking in his shoes. Little by little, Joseph came to understand how basic were the animosities between his people and the old settlers, and he showed himself willing to compromise even on fundamental issues. Missouri had particularly resented the communistic nature of the Mormon settlement. With the closing of the storehouse, the order and independence had collapsed. A reaction upon the heavily mortgaged Kirtland order could not be avoided, and its decline set in swiftly. In the Missouri debacle, Joseph now saw a chance to erase the whole economic experiment, which in Kirtland had never yielded anything but trouble, and at the same moment make a concession to the Gentile world. Not even Rigdon's lofty protests could surmount the argument that to abolish communism would ease the tension in Zion. On April 10, 1834, the Kirtland Council dissolved the order. Dividing the community property was a thorny business. Tired of quibbling and recrimination, Joseph finally resorted to a revelation to parcel out the real estate, deeding himself the temple lot, Rigdon the tannery, Cowdery the printing shop, and most of the other leaders the lots on which they were then living. In 1835, when the time came to print this curious document in the Doctrine and Covenants, he substituted fictitious names to avoid any unpleasantness. Ashashta for Whitney, Eliha for Cowdery, Pelagorum for Rigdon, Mahemson for Harris, and Gazalam for himself. He even used code names for the industries, Lanshin House for the printing shop, and Ozonda for the store. Except for a few leaders who knew better, the Mormons believed these to be the names of the people living in the days of Enoch. From this moment, Joseph began to efface the communistic rubric in his young theology. Since most copies of the Book of Commandments had been burned, it was easy for him to revise drastically the revelation on the United Order when it was republished in the enlarged Doctrine and Covenants in 1835. The Lord no longer demanded a consecration of a man's total property, but only a donation of his surplus, over and above living expenses. In reprinting the first 12 issues of the Evening and Morning Star, Joseph revised most, though not all, of the descriptions of the original order and commanded his missionaries to destroy the notion abroad that the church had ever become a common stock concern. Although Rigdon repeatedly urged a restoration, Joseph made only one effort to revive the order after 1834. This was a greatly revised consecration program that he launched in Missouri in 1838. It collapsed at the end of the year when the Mormons were driven out of the state altogether. Thereafter, the prophet was content to let the United Order be translated to the plane of abstract ideals, where it was destined to remain. Years after his death, experiments with communal living were tried in the desert isolation of the Great Basin, but these also disintegrated because, it was said, the Mormons proved as yet unworthy to live the higher law of God. During Joseph's lifetime, however, there was never a return to complete freedom of enterprise. The church remained a force in the financial and economic affairs of its members, and the prophet never lost the conviction that it was his right to be mentor to his people in matters of property and finance as well as matters of the spirit. Joseph's kingdom, unlike that of Jesus, was unmistakably of this world.